we go. Hi everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here today to share this with you about this information with you about the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks. It's been an amazing journey. I started working for the Ohio History Connection back in 1988 and was hired as the curator and site archaeologist for the Newark Earthworks and Flint Ridge. And as soon as I started working there, and experiencing and teaching people about and learning about the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks, I became convinced they should be recognized on the UNESCO World Heritage List. And to some extent, been working towards that for all these years. And it's very gratifying to have seen this become a reality just last year. And I'll have a slide to share on that in just a moment. Let's see, why are my slides not advancing? There we go.
There you are.
So here's a map showing the location of the 8 separate sites that together make up the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks. And of course, starting up at Newark, which is my sort of favorite site, the site that I've worked at for years, there are 2 components there, the Great Circle and the Octagon. And then down in the lower left, there's Fort Ancient Earthworks in Warren County. That's a third, and those 3 sites are owned, operated, managed by the Ohio History Connection. And the other 5 sites make up Hopewell Culture National Historical Park. So they're owned and operated by the National Park Service. But we, as part of this World Heritage nomination, work very closely together and have been working very closely together for years, even before the World Heritage Initiative. But especially with the World Heritage nomination, we have to have an overarching management plan that covers these 8 sites. So we communicate a lot together about, the interpretation, preservation, all the issues that go into World Heritage. So these are the most sort of stellar Hopewell earthwork sites. And there could have been others that we would have included in the nomination, but the United States Department of the Interior requires that to be nominated to the World Heritage List, you first have to be either a National Historic Landmark or a National Park Service site. So some sites like Fort Hill, they're on the National Register, but they're not National Historical Landmarks, could not be included. And clearly there are other sites that it would have been nice to include, but we think we have a really comprehensive set that shows all the major features of these earthworks, and I'll try and get into that. Oh yes, and here we are at Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. That's the group of us there, the delegation. You can see me on the far left there. Worst jet lag I've ever had in my life. But we had not only representatives from the National Park Service and representatives from the Ohio History Connection, we also had representatives from 5 federally recognized tribes that were presumably their ancestors were involved in this because of the extent of what's called the Hopewell interaction sphere. Virtually all of the indigenous peoples of the Eastern Woodlands, I think, played a part in this. But these particular 5 tribes contributed tribal resolutions of support for the World Heritage nomination, and they were very excited about it. And on the right-hand corner there in the picture, right above the Romania sign there, seated is Chief Glenna Wallace, she's the chief of the Eastern Shawnee tribe. And she's probably been our strongest ally for the longest time. And when she talks about World Heritage, it always brings tears to my eyes because she says that for all of her life, she has only ever heard of her ancestors being referred to as savages. But now, with World Heritage inscription, she's hearing her ancestors spoken of as geniuses. And that's such a profound sea change for her, for the other tribes, particularly for the young people growing up in the tribes, to see that their sites, their ancestor sites, are sort of on the World Heritage List right alongside all the glories of world civilizations around the world. Oh, and on the left there is the chairperson bringing his gavel down, which made the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks a World Heritage Site. So to become a World Heritage Site, you have to demonstrate that your sites have outstanding universal value. Um, I'm getting some garbling. I don't know if not everybody's muted or something, but anyway, I'll just keep going. So outstanding universal value means the value is not simply state level or national level. The story that these sites tell is a story that the world deserves to hear. And that's how you're evaluated. And these, of course, are some of the sites that are on the list: the Great Pyramid of Egypt, the Great Wall of China, the Colosseum in Rome. All of these are, we are next to, we are adjacent to, on the same list as all of these sites and more. There are, I think, 7 different criteria that you can sort of apply. Say, we think our sites meet these criteria to demonstrate outstanding universal value. And we used criterion 1 and criterion 3. Criterion 1 was the one we really wanted to focus on and that we really hoped to get recognized for. And that's that these sites are masterpieces of human creative genius. Now, we understood, working with our partners in the Department of the Interior, that that's a very high bar. And they recommended, why don't you add criterion 3 too? So if you don't make criterion 1, you'll still get to be a World Heritage Site on criterion 3, which is simply that you demonstrate that you have a unique or exceptional testimony to a cultural tradition or a civilization. And yeah, we felt we could easily meet that bar, but all of us were committed to showing these people were geniuses. It wasn't just a unique civilization. It was a fabulous, incredible civilization. And the image that you're looking into the gateway of the Great Circle at Newark. We, in fact, did get recognized for both. So the World Heritage Committee, the ICOMOS, the International Council for Monuments and Sites that evaluated our sites in the field, all agreed that yes, these sites are masterpieces of human creative genius. And then just to take a step back about what is the Hopewell culture? It's an ancient indigenous American Indian culture that constructed monumental earthworks in southern and central Ohio between about AD 1 and 400, or 1 to 400 CE. And one of the pieces of the outstanding universal value puzzle here is that you're looking there at a reconstruction of what the Newark earthworks might have looked like 2,000 years ago. And it's actually bigger than it because it goes off the picture to the right. And what a lot of people don't understand is this wasn't a city. These monumental Hopewell earthworks aren't the walls of cities. Thousands of people never lived here. In fact, the Hopewell lived in scattered, tiny little communities. They're so small, archaeologists don't call them villages. We call them hamlets, but that's not a very familiar term. You can almost think of them as homesteads, maybe an extended family living, in a clearing in the forest with a garden. They did have agriculture, but it was not massive field agriculture that would have fed thousands of people. It's a garden, and it was an important part of their diet, particularly over the winter. And most people think you imagine, well, they were growing corn. But no, corn was domesticated in Mexico, and it didn't make it up into the Ohio Valley until like AD 900. But they were growing domesticated plants, a local series of plants that had been domesticated a few thousand years before the Hopewell. And it included sunflower, squash, goosefoot, maygrass, little barley, and some other plants. And collectively, those are referred to as the Eastern Agricultural Complex. And the Ohio-Mississippi valleys is one of only about 7, maybe 8 places in the world where indigenous people domesticated the local plants. So domesticated plants are everywhere now, but the corn, for an example, that was domesticated in the Valley of Mexico and then spread out to conquer the world, so to speak. But Mexico is where the ancestral plant was domesticated. And sunflower, squash, and these other plants were domesticated here in the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. So these people didn't live in cities. They had no kings or queens or imperial authoritarian leaders of any sort. And I had there no corn. So corn is the big advantage of corn is that you can feed more people per acre with corn than any of the other plants. So corn replaced many of the Eastern agricultural complex plants because that's what they needed. And you could grow acres of corn and feed cities full of people. And the World Heritage Site of Cahokia in Illinois is an example. That's 1,000 years after Hopewell by the Mississippian culture. It's a city, 20,000 people probably lived there. At the center of the city, there's this giant pyramid with a flat top, and a king, a virtual king, lived in a palace on top of that mound. And that king's word was law. And so there's the difference. These indigenous people in Ohio had no king, no cities, and yet somehow they were able to marshal hundreds, thousands of people's labor to build these earthworks. And then they're on such a huge scale, thousands and thousands of people must have been coming here. These aren't sort of a community church. These are monumental cathedrals meant to encompass thousands of people. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But the scale is truly monumental. And one of the sort of fun questions of the outstanding universal value is how does a totally egalitarian civilization, scattered people living in little communities all over the place, how do they build monumental architecture when normally when we think of great civilizations, those kinds of achievements require a king to make you do it, and a sort of a hierarchically structured society with the king at the top and then nobles and so on all the way down. And there's no cities, so there's no aggregated people to be able to go out and execute building that monumental architecture. But somehow these indigenous ancient American Indian Hopewell people were able to do it. They got people excited. They got people committed to this amazing vision of creating these incredible earthworks. And it's just a bit of a mystery how they were able to do that. And we can talk more about that later in the questions if you like. So here's the Great Circle earthwork. It's a geometric earthwork. So there are different kinds of earthen enclosures that the Hopewell built, and I'm going to share these with you. But for me, this is close to my heart because this is one of the Newark earthworks components. The Great Circle is 1,200 feet across. It's enormous. The scale is hard to appreciate unless you're there. One indication of the scale is that after the Civil War, there was a grand reunion of the soldiers and sailors who'd served in Ohio that was held at the Great Circle. It was preserved because they made it the county fairgrounds, and there was like a grand pavilion there, a grandstand where people could, sit and watch horse races and things. But anyway, the Cincinnati newspaper said 15 to 20,000 people gathered inside the Great Circle to hear orations from President Rutherford B. Hayes, soon to be President General James Garfield, William Tecumseh Sherman, and other notables. So did 20,000 indigenous people gather there 2,000 years ago? Maybe. I mean, that's the scale. So it's the scale that's why build something that big unless you're expecting that many people to be there. And the Great Circle is only one component of the much larger Newark earthworks that covered 4.5 square miles. There's the other element from Newark, that's the circle octagon. This plays a really pivotal role in our argument for outstanding universal value, because this is where, as I'll mention here in a little bit, the astronomy, the astronomical alignments that sort of define the architecture there were first rediscovered, and where they're best presented, I guess, for a visitor experience. Now you see it's a golf course now. It will cease being a golf course on January 1st. But we'll have much more visitor access next year. But I want to point out the circle is called the observatory circle. So it's a circle connected with this little neck of walls to an octagonal enclosure. Now, the octagon is one of the biggest enclosures in the Hopewell world. You could actually put 4 Roman Colosseums comfortably inside the octagon. But going back to the observatory circle, it's a perfect circle, 1,054 feet in diameter. And it was called the observatory circle back in 1848 when one of the first surveys of the earthworks was published by the Smithsonian Institution. And at the very sort of bottom of the picture, you can see, well, maybe you can't see, but it's on the far edge of that circle, and it's a mound that seems to be blocking off a former gateway there. And that mound is like twice as high as the rest of the earthworks. And it's been called Observatory Mound since 1848 or probably earlier. But back then it was because it was viewed like an observation platform. If you got up on it, you got a good observation view of the earthworks. Now, with the astronomy that we found connected with this site, the name has taken on a whole new significance. But that diameter is important, 1,054 feet, because that diameter shows up in Hopewell architecture all over the Hopewell world. So they had a common unit of measure. They could lay out, design, and build monumental earthworks in different places to the same scale, to the same diameter. And it even goes deeper than that. So here's all the 8 sites that make up the Hopewell Culture ceremonial earthworks. And the octagon is in the upper left. And that observatory circle diameter, which has the unfortunate abbreviation OCD, shows up in everywhere, either the observatory circle diameter itself or multiples of it, except the Great Circle. But we'll bring that back into the story here in a second. So Hopeton Earthworks, the circle there has that same diameter. Mound City, the diagonals are of that measurement. At Fort Ancient, which you haven't seen yet, but I'll show you, there are 4 stone mounds that form a perfect square, and the sides of that square are equal to 1/2 of the OCD, and so on. So it demonstrates that there is this knowledge of geometry, a consistent understanding of geometry, and it goes deeper. Some circles and squares have the same area. And that's something the Pythagoreans in ancient Greece were struggling with. Well, these people were struggling with it, were playing with the idea too, and coming to very close approximations in their architecture. I want to mention the Circleville earthworks for a moment because it's part of this story. You cannot go see the Circleville earthworks now because they've been totally destroyed. All that's left are the historic markers that you can see walking through town. But Circleville had 2 circles, a larger circle and a smaller circle inside it connected to a square. The larger circle had the same diameter as Newark's Great Circle, 1,200 feet. And the inner circle had the 1,054 feet diameter observatory circle diameter. So here again is just another example of that repeated, precise geometry showing up in site after site after site. So those are geometric earthworks. Fort Ancient is the best, largest example of what's called a hilltop enclosure. That's an enclosure that sort of is defined by the shape of the hilltop on which it's built. And these used to be considered forts, hence the name Fort Ancient. But as you can see, well, you probably can't count them, but you can see many, many gateways interrupting the walls. There are something like 84 gateways. So if you're building a fort to defend, you don't have that many gateways. That's like having a sieve instead of a fortress wall. Also, there are ditches filled with water that some people think might be moats, but they're inside the walls, not outside. So it really makes no sense whatsoever as a fort if you think about it critically. It's just a different kind of ceremonial center. For one thing, there seem to be fewer burial mounds associated with hilltop enclosures. So, but it's still a ceremonial place, still a place of ceremony, and it's enormous. The walls that encompass those two plateaus are 3.5 miles long. And there's a lot of trees there now. So when you visit it, you really have to walk through it and pay close attention to the walls to get a sense of that scale. The walls sometimes seem to get lost in that forest. And then finally, Mound City is an exception. It's not a square. It's not really a geometric earthwork. It's got this, it's a square with rounded corners. And what's interesting about that shape, all the mounds at Mound City, when they were excavated, what archaeologists found at the bottom were houses, probably ceremonial houses, almost like shrines or temples, in which American Indian ancestors were cremated. And when sort of the floor was covered with all these cremation basins, then they tore the house down and built a mound over it. So it's interesting that each mound has at its base that outline in the shape of a house in which these ancestral ancestors there were buried and enclosed. So it's like a house for the ancestors for their uh, journey to the next world. And then all of those separate mounds are enclosed by the same shape. So it's almost like a earthwork house plan to enclose the houses, individual house mounds of all the ancestral remains held there. So it's a different kind of enclosure and really interesting. And it's one of the earliest of the Hopewell sites. Excuse me. Another aspect of outstanding universal value is the vast extent of cultural influence 2,000 years ago, all sort of emanating from and converging on central Ohio, southern and central Ohio. And it's called the Hopewell Interaction Sphere. I know back when I was an undergraduate, this was being presented as a trade network. And I have no doubt that trade was involved. But I think it's different from that. I think this is not fundamentally a trade network. Instead, I think Ohio, as the old travel and tourism slogan, and now it's been resurrected, Ohio, the heart of it all. 2,000 years ago, it truly was the heart of it all. I think it was the center of a great religion, and it drew pilgrims from quite literally, as you see this map, from the ends of their world, bringing offerings of special things from their homelands to be presented as ceremonial offerings at these pilgrimage centers. So there's copper from southern Canada. There's giant conch shells from the Gulf of Mexico, all found in these Hopewell mounds. There's mica down in the Carolinas, a beautiful, glistening, flat, platy material that you can peel off in sheets and cut them into shapes like that raptor claw. And then all the way into the Rocky Mountains, there's this volcanic glass called obsidian. Now, each volcano has its own unique chemical fingerprint. And when these giant spear points, although they really didn't function as spear points because they're like a foot long, so they're more like symbolic spear points. These were made from obsidian that comes from obsidian cliffs in Yellowstone Park. So about 80% of the obsidian artifacts found in Hopewell sites come from there, and the other 20 come from nearby in Idaho at a site called Bear Gulch. So all of the obsidian comes from the Rocky Mountains, maybe 2,000 miles away. And this is the best example of why it's not trade. Because with trade, what you have is you have the source of the obsidian or the source of the flint or whatever. And then the people in that area have all that they want. So they trade some of what they've got with neighboring villages that maybe don't have the access to the quarries. So those people, then their neighbors have lots of obsidian, and then they trade some of what they've got to neighboring villages, and then those villages trade some of what they got to neighboring villages, and so on. But pretty soon, probably before you get to the Mississippi River, you don't have enough obsidian to trade, and maybe now you don't have any obsidian at all. So that's what you see is this drop-off curve. Lots of obsidian at the source area, the curve drops off and eventually ends because you're too far away. And that ends before the Mississippi River. And then you go for ways with no obsidian, but then you find this big spike of obsidian in Ohio. So that's not village to village trade. That's either pilgrims from Wyoming find out about this amazing thing happening, take offerings of obsidian and go present them there. Or, and actually, that's the interpretation I prefer. But there's also some work that an anthropologist by the name of Mary Helms did in Panama, where she studied ceremonial leaders there that would go on walkabout. They would just take journeys, go off 100 miles, 200 miles, find some extraordinary material and bring it back. And then people would say, wow, that's really cool stuff. We've never seen that before. And those ceremonial leaders would gain more status. So it's maybe one or the other, or maybe both of those things are happening here. But Ohio is where it all comes in. And what goes out is just a smattering of artifacts made of Flint Ridge flint. Flint Ridge flint was one of the signature flints of the Hopewell culture. It's a beautiful flint. It comes in all the colors of the rainbow. It's very distinctive. And I think small artifacts, bladelets that are like replaceable razor blades, or small little triangular bifaces that are not quite finished spear points, you can think of them as, or knives. Those I think were given away as gifts. And when you look at pilgrimage cross-culturally, very often the pilgrim comes to the center, perhaps bringing offerings, perhaps not, but they take away a kind of a pilgrim token, a token that they can take back home to show that they've made on the great journey, the great Hajj, whatever. And in this case, they might have been given a Flint Ridge flint bladelet. And then when they go home, they pull that bladelet out for an important occasion, maybe to something like cut their daughter's wedding cake or something. And people are really impressed. Wow, you've got a Flint Ridge flint bladelet. You've been on the great journey to Chillicothe or Newark. And so I think that's what this is. And it used to be mistaken for a trade network, but instead I think it's something much different. Okay, and now the knowledge of astronomy built into the earthworks. This is something that was not rediscovered until the 1980s. Nobody knew it before then. And this is the circle and the octagon at Newark lined up. Its main axis is lined up to where the moon rises at its northernmost point on the eastern horizon. So before I got into this, I had no idea that there was a lunar cycle. I mean, I knew about the phases of the moon, but for me, it's like, well, sometimes the moon is out during the day, sometimes it's out at night, sometimes it's rising over there, sometimes it's in the sky over there. I never got a sense of the rhythm. Now, the sun, I mean, we all understand the rhythm and the cycle of the sun. The sun has a northernmost rise of the moon, or the sun has a northernmost rise point on the eastern horizon, and that's the summer solstice. And 6 months later, it's got a southernmost rise point on the horizon, and that's the winter solstice. And the equinox is in between. And that yearly seasonal rhythm, we all just understand almost on a gut level. It turns out the moon does the same thing. It has a northernmost rise point and a southernmost rise point, and it does it every month, actually. But what makes it so much more complicated is that angle changes from month to month over an 18.6-year-long cycle. And archaeologists, archaeoastronomers, astronomers for a long time didn't believe ancient indigenous people would have even cared about such a long cycle. I mean, people were saying, oh, yes, Stonehenge is aligned to the summer solstice, supposedly, and that's important for an agricultural calendar. So, of course, ancient people lined things up to the sun, maybe, but the moon, who cares about an 18.6-year-long cycle? Well, these are the two guys that rediscovered that. On the left is Robert Horn. He was a philosopher at Earlham College in Indiana, and on the right is Ray Hively. He was a physicist and an astronomer at Earlham. And they were team teaching a class in the late 70s. And this was about the time that Gerald Hawkins' book, Stonehenge Decoded, had just come out. Excuse me, one moment. And Hawkins was arguing that Stonehenge was actually a sophisticated astronomical, computer. And Bob and Ray didn't believe it because they said if you look at Stonehenge, you can draw so many lines through the different openings that just by chance, one or two of them might line up to the summer solstice. So they didn't think Stonehenge proved anything, that ancient people weren't that smart. They weren't paying attention to the sky. I mean, if you put Stonehenge on a roulette wheel and spun it like 97 times out of 100, you'd be able to find solstice alignments, 2, 3, maybe more, in that same alignment, in that same configuration. So they wanted to say, and use sort of as a critical thinking exercise in this class, that this wasn't true, that the idea that this was an intentionally built astronomical computer by ancient people, they believed that was not true and they could show it. Well, they couldn't take their students to Stonehenge, too much money, but Bob Horn had been to Newark and the Octagon. And he said the Octagon has all these different lines of the walls, there's all these different openings, you can draw dozens of lines across it. We can go there and show, oh, look, there's a summer solstice alignment. There just happens to be. Because if you make a monument complicated enough, it's going to have just by chance some of these alignments. So they go to Newark, they sort of make their maps, they draw every line they can think of, and none of them point to a solstice or equinox. And they're scratching their heads because as they told the story to me, that's statistically significant. So you put the Octagon on a roulette wheel and spin it, and yeah, 88 times, whatever, out of 100, there's going to be a solstice alignment. So they were like, wow, it's almost like they intentionally made it not to line up to the sun. And then they tell me one of them, and they don't remember which one, said to the other, well, maybe it's not lined up to the sun because it's lined up to something else. And then well, what else is up there? Well, of course, the moon. Then they started looking for the moon cycle, and they found all 8, the 4 defining rise points, and to the west, the 4 defining set points. So the northernmost rise of the moon is lined up to the main axis. The maximum southern moon rise is lined up along the wall on the bottom there, pointing to the far south, southeast, and all of those cycles, the northernmost rise, the southernmost rise, 9.3 years later, the northern minimum rise and the southern minimum rise. 9.3 years later, you're back where you started. All of those, and you have 4 corresponding set points. And there are alignments to all 8 of those points on the horizon incorporated into the circle and octagon's architecture. And back in the 80s, they were amazed by, they thought this was amazing. They had started out trying to disprove the idea that ancient people knew all this stuff about astronomy, but ended up sort of creating one of the most elegant arguments for proving that these people were very careful sky watchers over generations and incorporated those alignments into their architecture. So they take that to guy who was then the foremost archaeologist, Hopewell archaeologist in the world. And he was at Kent State University, and they took this to him, and they tell me he laughed at them. And he said, no. You have to understand, these people were savages. They didn't know all this. So they became very discouraged and thought, maybe we're wrong. At least the archaeologists don't think we're on anything. Well, later, 88, I become working at the Newark Earthworks. I read their paper, which was really only about 6 years old at that point, and I'm like really impressed. And they're only over in Indiana, so I called them up and asked if they would come and give a lecture at our museum. And they were like, oh, wow, sure. And we had conversations, and they got more excited about the research. And now they've written many more papers about this. And as you'll see, these alignments aren't just found at Newark, they're found in almost all the Hopewell sites. The only other circle and octagon that the Hopewell built is in Chillicothe, and it's one of the World Heritage Sites. It's called High Bank Works. And you already know the circle is identical in size to the observatory circle, but it also has all of those lunar rise and set points incorporated somewhat differently into its architecture. This is the north part of the Fort Ancient earthworks. And I mentioned those four stone mounds. There's a picture of one of them. They're actually earthen mounds covered with a facing of stone. And if you stand on the farthest western one, you can stand there and sight through the different gateways. And one of them points to the maximum northern moonrise. You sight through another gateway that points to the summer solstice sunrise. And you point through another gate and it points to the minimum northern moonrise. So it's clear that it was important to these people to bring the rhythms of the cosmos down to earth and incorporate them into their ceremonial architecture. And I don't know why, but I think the best explanation was offered in a totally, not totally, but in a somewhat different context by Vine Deloria Jr., the late Vine Deloria Jr. He was an American Indian activist and author. And this is from an essay that he wrote, not about the mounds. He was writing about American Indian architecture in general. But I think this is at the core of the astronomy at these earthworks. He wrote, wherever possible, the larger cosmos was represented and reproduced to provide a context in which ceremonies could occur. Thus, people did not feel alone. They participated in cosmic rhythms. So almost like 18.6 years ago, I got to watch the northernmost rise of the moon along the main axis of the octagon. And it was a very moving experience, even for me, steeped in Western traditions that had nothing to do with indigenous traditions, but standing in this place where people stood 2,000 years ago, watching the same moon rise in the same place, seeing that connection with architecture and sky and ceremony, it was profoundly moving. And we're coming up on the next northernmost rise. We're hoping to get things worked out with the country club, and even once they're gone, have a public observance of this event there. And there's a number of times over the course of that particular year when the northernmost rise is very close, or not, there is the absolute northernmost rise, but subsequent moon rises are often very, very close, even visually almost indistinguishable. So there are multiple opportunities for people to be able to see this. And I hope we do end up with public events and sort of keep watching the Ohio History Connections website, Facebook page, whatever, for those kinds of announcements. And then finally, I think these earthworks are appreciable, not just as architecture, not just as geometry and astronomy, but as art. Barnett Newman was a abstract expressionist painter in America, and he wrote. This is from a journal. He said, "Walking inside the Fort Ancient and Newark earthworks, one is confounded by a multiplicity of sensations. That here are the greatest works of art on the American continent. That here in the seductive Ohio Valley are perhaps the greatest art monuments in the world." And on the left, I've got one of his works of art that I stole off the Met's webpage that is untitled. But the image on the upper left there seems to evoke the Great Circle. And I wonder if it wasn't part of his inspiration there. Concludes the formal part. I'll quit sharing the screen and I can address questions as long as you have questions, really. Let me stop sharing. I can always go back to it if somebody wants to see a particular image. Okay. Well, any questions? I certainly still have lots of questions about all this.
Well, yeah, I would offer one. When you're uh, presenting the idea of the exchange network being based in a pilgrimage
Mhm.
where gifts were then presented, it brings to mind like the we three kings of Orient are, the Magi, and I don't know if that's a good comparison or not, but that's kind of what comes to mind. Is that any comment on that in return?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the analogy works. I mean, for developing this argument, I looked at pilgrimages all over the world. I mean, there's Christian pilgrimages, there's Muslim pilgrimages, of course. We're all familiar with the Great Hajj to Mecca. There are Buddhist, Taoist. I mean, basically all cultures. There are documented indigenous American Indian cultures in South America, in Mesoamerica. There are traditions of the Creek Indians that lived in the southeastern United States of having undertaken pilgrimages to special mounds in the north. And I don't know how far north, but I think those traditions might be evoking making pilgrimages to Chillicothe, perhaps on to Newark. So, no, I mean, and pilgrimage, of course, there are differences, cultural differences, but it's all sort of at root making a journey to a special place and doing something at that place, presenting an offering, having some special experience there. So pilgrimage is, I won't say universal. I've read some people that claim it is, but it's virtually universal. All kinds of people sort of reach a moment in their life or something when they want to sort of look beyond, step outside their normal life and experience something. And maybe it's like, oh, I don't know. I'm talking too much. I need to get back to your questions. But no, I think each of those examples, whether it's Buddhist or Taoist, has parallels, has sort of Venn diagrams, has overlap with what I'm arguing about for Newark. And the fact that it is almost universal means it would almost be weird if they weren't doing pilgrimages.
And this might be where the Hopewell Road kind of comes in as part of a pilgrimage.
Yes, and that's where I first came up with the interpretation because it's like, well, what the heck is this Hopewell Road? Why make a perfectly straight road that may have gone as much as 60 miles and connected these two distant places? And I was looking at parallels, like the long straight roads in Chaco Canyon that the ancestral Puebloans built. And I read about Mayan long roads. They called them Sacbeab, which means white road. And these were built of earth and faced with white limestone. And they could go many, many miles in a perfectly straight line across the Yucatan Peninsula. And if they came to a lake, they built a causeway across the lake to keep the road perfectly straight. And at Chaco Canyon, if one of their roads came to a cliff, they cut handholds or stairways into the cliff to keep the road going perfectly straight. And it's like, why are people going to all this effort to make a perfectly straight road? And then it came to, well, it seems like it's a religious thing. I mean, it evokes the Judeo-Christian straight and narrow way, although these roads are by no means narrow in most cases. So, yeah, I mean, I think so. I came to this conclusion that these are religious and look at the Hopewell interaction sphere, things coming in from the ends of the world. So, yeah, these are pilgrims coming to these centers, following these sacred roads that connect these centers and presenting offerings there and then experiencing the transcendental experiences that people have at these places.
So, what was the span of this Hopewell fluorescence? Was it like 500 years
It's
or
about four or 500. We're arguing the date range we came up with was AD 1 to 400.
yeah,
More recently, Mark Seaman from Kent State and Kevin Nolan from Ball State University, no, Ball State, I think Ball State, did a paper where they did this Bayesian analysis of Hopewell radiocarbon dates, and they came up with 100 BC to AD 400. So in that case, yeah, it's more like 500, but it's in that ballpark.
well, that had to be whatever was fueling all of that had to be that had to be pretty sustainable. I mean, so through some kind of leadership or religion, or I mean, I guess that's all, you know, that's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah, but it does seem to be religion because the leaders of the society are ceremonial leaders. So there are people buried in the mounds who are buried with lots of regalia. But when you compare, uh, and this was back when archaeologists excavated burial mounds, which we don't do anymore. But when you compare the human remains and their bone chemistry and muscle attachment areas, even men and women buried with the most regalia have the same kinds of muscle attachments as everybody else. They lived in the same houses as everybody else. So, yes, when they are in the great circle performing ceremonies, they're the leaders. If they're laying out an earthwork and telling people where to go because they know the geometry, they're the leaders. But when they go home, they have to go, hunt deer, go fish, take out the garbage, just like everybody else. And they live in the same kinds of houses as everybody else. 1,000 years later at Cahokia, I mean, if you're the leader on top of the pyramid, he doesn't have, he didn't work a day in his life. He had more access to meat than anybody that lived down in the commoners. Um, all the people living, and he lives in a palace. So that's the difference between, I mean, the Hopewell egalitarian culture doing amazing things just because they're working together for this common purpose, probably religiously motivated. And at Cahokia, you've got a king living on a pyramid that's telling people what to do. And he gets to eat better and live better and have all kinds of, wives. Um, and, that's a really interesting sort of social trajectory, how you go from here to here. How do you get people to give up their autonomy to be, servants of a king? And traditionally, we know Native Americans have rejected that. And actually, Cahokia does collapse, maybe because there's a commoners' revolt saying we're tired of putting up with this. And there's all kinds of ideas about that, but I'm not a specialist in that area.
Dr. Lepper, is there any speculation on what kind of technique or device these people would have used to lay out these perfect 1,054 feet circles in various locations?
Yeah, and you put it well because it is largely speculation because we don't have any evidence of things like transits or tools. We do have plumb bobs, um, and what we suspect is they were using poles and cordage knotted off in whatever was their common unit of measure, their equivalent of a foot or yard or meter or whatever they used. And then those could be, long, and they would put that post at the center, stretch the cord out, and then just like using a compass on paper, walk around in an arc, and they could design all kinds of geometry using just cords and poles. But
Hello.
those are wood and cordage, so they would not have preserved in the
Sorry, how are
archaeological
you
record.
doing? Good, pretty good. Yes.
Did that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
I have a question about some findings that you may have from the site. So one of the things that I really found interesting at Stonehenge was that they find a lot of food remains, suggesting that people were just partying like we do now. They're just having a holiday. They're eating lots of good food. Is there any evidence at Hopewell of that kind of activity?
Yes, there are feasting pits. There are things that are like offerings of food. So, and yes, if thousands and thousands of people were coming here, they must have been fed. And there's evidence. What was his name? Kendra McLaughlin did pollen soil cores in the trenches at Fort Ancient that were filled with water, and she was able to do sort of a pollen analysis. And she found that during the time, like right after the Hopewell built it, and for that 400 years, the landscape had been completely cleared of trees. She said the Hopewell period was comparable to what happened when Europeans come in later and denude the area of vegetation, but that there were also lots of Eastern agricultural complex plants in the area contributing their pollen. And since those are local plants, well, I have this notion that they'd be easy to grow. You just throw the seeds, and since they're local plants, they would just grow. But I've been corrected by that by people who actually work with these plants, and they say, well, no, you have to do this and that. So, and they're kind of fussy. But clearly in the pollen record, it shows there were acres of the Eastern agricultural plants growing in close proximity to Fort Ancient. So I think these ceremonies are obviously timed for spring, summer, autumn, when you can actually be digging earth out of the ground when it's not frozen. If it's around the autumn, you've got, you know, the harvests, the nuts, hunting deer, fishing in the streams nearby, that, you know, could, with sufficient people sort of dedicated to doing that, feed multitudes. Um, but yeah, and so I don't know that I'd characterize it as partying. There's ceremonial feasts. There probably are celebrations of, like, yes, the sun is going to continue to rise now because we've made these offerings, and that's a wonderful thing. So, you know, there's a sort of a celebration for that. Um, but yes, clearly eating is a big part of the ceremonies there, but it's also a big part of just getting people fed that are there from who knows where. And another aspect of that, sort of a practical thing that's happening, and it may be sort of a subtext, is if you live in tiny little dispersed communities, how do you find a marriage partner for your sons and daughters? Well, if every 18.6 years or even 9.3 years, you're gathering together in large numbers at these ceremonial places, those kinds of marriages can be negotiated and worked out. And so you don't have inbreeding. And so that, and that's not the purpose, but I think that's a really important thing that's happening alongside the ceremonies.
I noticed on one of your aerial photos a much smaller perfect circle right next to the octagon. Uh, any idea what that might have been about?
Not really. None of those really have been excavated, but those are virtually identical to the circles built by the previous culture, the culture that we call the Adena culture. They lived they lived in the same kinds of communities, but they had smaller spheres of influence. So those would have been, for the Adena, their community church. Those circles are about 200 feet in diameter. And the Hopewell explosion at about 100 BC or AD 1 saw those churches, you know, become gigantic cathedrals, but yet they still hang around in these sites. And whether they're shrines for different sects or something, or who knows what, there may be sweat lodges in those for purification rites or something. Um, or like I say, that maybe they're for different clans to meet for more private ceremonies. We don't really know because nobody's really tried to excavate those yet. And maybe we'll have an opportunity when the country club leaves and we can actually do research at that site.
Brad, are there circles like that at any of the other sites? Like in other words, could the Hopewell be, you know, amplifying on the roots of religious ceremonies created by the Adena in some of the same areas and then just ramping it up on a major scale?
Yes, that there are some of those small circles associated with many of the other sites, particularly the geometric ones.
Mm-hmm.
And either, yes, that it was already an Adena ceremonial center and they're just blowing it up, or, and I argued about this with another archaeologist named Martin Byers. He talks about the Great Circle, with its interior ditch that conforms sort of exactly to the architectural canons of the Adena. You have circles with an interior ditch with water. Most of the Hopewell circles don't have that. So he thought that actually might be Adena. And I thought, well, because Newark looks like it's a unified composition. So I'm arguing that that this Great Circle was built by the Hopewell, but it was built intentionally to conform to more ancient architectural canons. So they were taking the architectural principles of Adena, blowing it up themselves, kind of like in the same way that we build banks and public buildings with Greek columns to sort of evoke that ancient time period. And we don't have enough good radiocarbon dates to be able to differentiate that. Someday maybe we will and be able to say, this dates to 100, 200 years before Hopewell. So it actually is an Indigenous ceremonial center that became incorporated into, at a later time, this Hopewell site. Or we'll be able to say, nope, this was built by the Hopewell and they're just mimicking or honoring previous architectural traditions.
Yeah, another question. I love this whole idea of these are pilgrimage sites, and they're not traders, but rather these are the special offerings that folks from afar use. How widely is accepted is that theory of yours?
Um, it's not universal. There's no consensus. I'm actually writing a paper now, sort of reevaluating the Great Hopewell Road notion, which is this parallel set of walls that came off the octagon and went in a perfectly straight line to the southwest. And early maps say, like in 1848, said that they only go 2.5 miles. But in 1862, two brothers traced it for 6 miles and said it was still going in a perfectly straight line. And if you continue that straight line, it goes straight to Chillicothe. And I thought maybe there was a 60-mile long road that connected these. And then I began looking for explanations for that. And the Maya built long, straight roads. I think I mentioned those that could go miles and miles through the jungle. And the Maya was still an extant, thriving civilization when the Spanish arrived. And Spanish priests asked them what were these long, straight roads that went through the jungle. And they were told that they were routes of pilgrimage that connect one sacred site with another. And that's one of the places where I said, well, so here's a model of long, straight roads going from one sacred place to another. The Hopewell aren't Maya, but they're in essence flowers on the same bush, because the people that populated America was like one big unified population, and then they just dispersed across these continents and then diversified. But they're all coming from sort of a common ideological base at the heart. Maybe we can make these extrapolations, and maybe the long straight roads at Chaco Canyon, they have been proposed as pilgrimage routes by Southwestern scholars. Other people disagree. But in sort of the latest big synthesis of Hopewell ceremonial architecture, it's an excellent book. I recommend it. It's written by Mark Lynott, and it's called Hopewell Ceremonial Landscapes of Ohio. And he talks about sort of my ideas, and he says, yeah, back when Brad first proposed the Great Hopewell Road, none of us really believed him. They thought I was kind of a nut. And says, but as I sort of developed this pilgrimage argument to explain it, and the pilgrimage argument helps to explain how you get thousands of people at a place to help build these earthworks. He says, yeah, this is making more sense. But so it's not widely, it's not 100% accepted, but I most of the colleagues that I work with think that it's got merit.
Well, it's particularly resonant for me. I used to work at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and for decades, I'd walk past our little exhibit of the mounds and the burial mounds, and then there's the fire pit, and there's the mica, and then there's the copper, and all these things. And the educators duly telling, well, they were magnificent traders, and they had this trade network. Maybe our how many conch shells will you give me for my Flint Ridge? Flint or something. And so it's a fascinating and different approach to think that they were actually offerings coming to this area.
Well, I'm a big fan of a podcast called The Infinite Monkey Cage that's done by the physicist and astronomer Brian Cox and a comedian named Robin Ince. They do it together, and it's wonderful. And in one of those, Robin Ince had this most memorable line that I sort of cling to. He says, science isn't about this is right. It's about this is the least wrong version of events we have for the time being. And so I think my pilgrimage notion is the least wrong version of events for this Hopewell that we have for the time being. And it makes more sense, and it sort of more of the pieces fit together than trade. Because like I said, you cannot make an argument that obsidian was traded from village to village here. It was out there, and somehow a mass of it got brought here. whether somebody from Ohio went out and got it, or whether someone from Wyoming brought it here in canoes or something. It is not trade. Some of the others might be. I mean, there was a history of trade of copper from Canada coming into Ohio for much longer than the Hopewell. That may be a continuation of that. Marine shells show up in Ohio much before the Hopewell. So trade is going on, and it no doubt continued, but that doesn't explain this explosion of exotic stuff showing up at Hopewell sites as good as I think the pilgrimage model does.
Dr. Lepper, what, clearly with some of these things, there's the scientific process of gathering and measuring and recording and interpreting. But it seems that intuition certainly plays a role in some of this problem solving. And then backtracking from an intuitive idea and trying to validate this isn't a trade network. This is something more. Obviously you saw something in there that caused you to kind of flip a switch and look at this from a different perspective. The last time I was knocking around down in that area, I was down at Fort Ancient with any of your colleagues. I was at Fort Ancient, and there was a professor there with a field team. I think they were from Youngstown State. It's been many, many, many years ago. But one of the features that they found on the floodplain of the Little Miami, down below the hilltop enclosure, was a kind of a flags and serpentine road. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, that was John White at Youngstown State.
Okay.
And he decided that they were serpent effigies, and there are two of them. So they're not like Serpent Mound in that they're not serpentine. They just have a gentle arc. But so there's these piled up limestone, and then at the end there are these big slabs that look a lot like a rattlesnake's tail. And he said that there were two of them. One of them, he says, if you put a pole at the head, when the summer solstice sun rises above Fort Ancient, the shadow cast by that pole tracks the body of the serpent. And then he found another one on the sort of the same side of the valley that is lined up to the winter solstice. So he thinks those are stone serpent effigies, and we know there are others in Kentucky and around there, and that they're related to the summer solstice and winter solstice.
Yeah, when I was down there talking with him, he was excited, but at the same time he was very cautious and very guarded, and telling me what he was thinking, what the hunch he had. And I recall when I was working for Greene County Park System, and we had several earthworks down there, I came across a retired county engineer from Illinois, and he was going all across the Midwest, and he was visiting all these sites he could, from the Squire Davis or the ancient monuments, that earthwork book that was published a couple centuries ago or whatever, monuments of the Ohio River Valley or whatever, you know what I'm talking about. And he was going to these sites, and he was using his surveying equipment at the time, which is nowhere near as sophisticated as we have today. And he was trying to measure these things and plot them out with as much precision as he could. And I tried to ask him, what do you think these things mean? And he said, I don't allow myself to think that way. I'm simply trying to record them as precisely as he. And so I think a beautiful thing in your area of study is you have that merger of science in the process, the scientific process, but you also have that engagement of the wonder of the data that you're looking at, and the effort to try to creatively interpret what you're seeing and to find the answers as to why. So it's a beautiful thing.
Well, thank you. And I think that's essential to science. I think if you're just recording, you're just a recorder. I mean, it's you're recording so that you can look for patterning, and then so that you can develop possible explanations for that patterning. And yeah, sometimes they're wild-ass guesses that seem to come out of nowhere.
Yeah.
But
Right.
I mean, scientific hypotheses don't, they can come from all over the place. I mean, there's the classic story about Darwin developing the theory of evolution, by all this careful thinking and recording. And Wallace comes up with it in a malarial dream, and then comes out, wow, maybe this is the explanation. So it doesn't matter where it comes from. What
Yeah.
matters is then how you go back to the data and look for, is it supported by the data?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a beautiful thing.
Dr. Lepper, next year after the golf course closes and you have full access to the site, are you anticipating any resistance from Native American groups to start digging in and excavating and doing more research in that area?
Well, we are working very closely with American Indian tribes now and consulting with them. And all the research that we plan to do at sites will be reviewed by them. And certainly if we wanted to dig into a burial mound, they would say no for very good reasons. But most of the things that we're dealing with at Newark have nothing to do with burials. The National Park Service is working with the tribes, and they've got an active research program every year investigating like trash pits to look at what food they might find, or pits in the earthworks that might have been places where big giant posts were set. So they've been able to keep that up. And it's not that American Indians are against research. It's just that they want to be included. They want questions that they're interested in to be addressed. And it's perfectly fair. I mean, they're the descendants of these people. So they should be intimately involved in all this work going forward.
And then with the closing of the golf course, was an attempt to be made to then recreate. I mean, it probably didn't have a whole lot of forest in it, so you're already close to that with a golf course. But to try and recreate the conditions with the best you can as the way they looked like 480.
Yeah, we're already doing it because we excavated a trench through the Great Circle back in 1992, and we found that it was built on a grassland. I would call it a prairie, but apparently a prairie has a technical definition. But it was grassland, and it shouldn't have been 2,000 years ago. It should have been a forest. But if you've read the book 1491, it talks about America wasn't a wilderness, even 2,000 years ago, even 10,000 years ago. It was a managed environment. People were clearing forests and burning them periodically to keep them cleared, because a forest doesn't have very many deer in it. But a forest with lots of openings has lots of deer. So they're deliberately managing the vegetation so that they have more meat to eat. And so yes, we know that sort of that whole landform on which earthworks were built was essentially a prairie when the Hopewell got there. And that allowed them to lay out their geometry using the poles and ropes. It allowed them full views of the horizon to watch the sun and the moon. So yeah, and our policy is not to replant any trees as they die, to proactively remove trees if it looks like they're going to fall over, if they've gotten ill or something, because if they fall over, they can tear up parts of the earthworks with the root ball coming out. So we try to do that proactively. But because the trees they provide shade, we've got some old growth trees in the Great Circle that Dawes Arboretum brings tours to people to come and see. So we don't want to go cut those down and like upset people. But yeah, we have a policy of when they fall down, they're not replaced. And eventually, yeah, they are going to sort of look more like they did in indigenous times.
It brings up an interesting question. Are the other earthworks also located in prairies or grassy areas or in floodplains or places that would be easier to maintain them in a tree-free environment?
Well, it depends. The geometric earthworks all seem to be built on second terraces that don't flood anymore, like the glacial terraces or something. And where they get down, some of them are even eroded if they're on too low a terrace and there's frequent flooding. The hilltop enclosures are on the tops of hills. And we know from Kenner McLaughlin's work that they cleared that forest at Hopewell times in order to be able to build it. So that probably wasn't a prairie when they got there, but they made it one because the landform was so perfect for them.
But the geometric earthworks seem to be in these secondary terraces.
Yeah, all the geometric earthworks are on these second terraces, but that doesn't necessarily mean they were prairies. And I think there's one other site, might have been Hopeton, where they've confirmed that it was also on a prairie. But that doesn't mean all of them were. There are so many that probably it wasn't all of them. But we don't know yet.
Here in northeastern Ohio, we have a handful of hilltop enclosures. Nowhere near as grand, it appears. But is there any kind of relationship between these hilltop enclosures that we have in Ohio further south and what we have up here in Northeast?
Not the kind of relationship that you're thinking of, but they are related. They are built 1,000 years later, and those are fortifications, actually. Villages were inside those. That's the so-called Whittlesey culture. And
Right.
yeah, that's sort of at the same time as the Mississippian time period. And there's more conflict. And yeah, villages are built inside these fortified places up on hilltops. So those actually are forts, fortified
Forts.
villages.
Excellent.
Yes, I do. We have in the chat box here, we had a question from Jill. Is there a book or books about the topic that Brad is discussing you can recommend? And I just pulled some from my bookshelf here. I'll start with Brad's book. Oh no, it's looking backwards there, but Ohio Archaeology, an illustrated chronicle of Ohio's ancient American Indian cultures. So that's top of the recommendation there.
Let me just say something about that first.
Yes.
Unfortunately, that's now out of print, but on my academia page online, I have PDFs of the chapters that you can download for free. So you can just go out and get the Middle Woodland chapter and read that. I wish it was still in print, but Orange Fraser Press made the decision not to keep printing it.
Yeah. Well, and we have, let's see, the Newark Earthworks, Enduring Monuments, Contested Meanings by edited by Lindsay Jones and Richard Shields. So again, Brad, if you just want to comment, thumbs up, thumbs down on these, recommended or
Oh yeah, that one's uneven. We did a big symposium with people from all different disciplines offering their perspectives on the earthworks. And I contributed a chapter from an archaeological perspective. Dick Shields was a historian. He has a historical overlook of the Newark sites. All these people offering their very different perspectives. So, I mean, it's kind of exciting, invigorating to see how different people have looked at it. But I think, in terms of how important I think they are, the chapters are a bit uneven.
Okay. And then we have Mysteries of the Hopewell, Astronomers, Geometers, Magicians of the Eastern Woodlands by William Romaine.
I have problems with some of Romaine's scholarship. He's a sort of popular writer. He does have a PhD from a English university for the archaeoastronomy. I love about 60% of what he writes. It's good stuff. I'm less and there's 10% that I think is not so good. And then in between there's other stuff. So, but yeah, it's probably a good introduction, but take some things with a grain of salt.
Okay. And Indian Mounds of the Middle Ohio Valley, a guide to mounds and earthworks of the Adena, Hopewell, Cole and Fort Ancient People, Susan Woodward and Jerry McDonald.
Yeah, they have great short summaries that are a little dated, but probably, that are pretty good. But the best thing about that is that gives you directions and information about all of the publicly accessible mound and earthwork sites in the Ohio region that you can go visit. So, I mean, everybody should have a copy of that.
All right, that's good. Well, now we got some older ones here, and these may be outdated in their information. The Mound Builders by Robert Silverberg. I know that's been out for a long time.
Yeah, and it's still basically good. Yeah,
Okay.
I got one more I want to show you.
Okay.
I mentioned it earlier. This is Mark Lynett's Hopewell Ceremonial Landscapes of Ohio.
Yeah.
It doesn't have an index, but the table of contents is pretty good. But Mark Lynett was a National Park Service archaeologist that worked on a lot of these sites, and he's got a lot of great ideas. And I mean, I refer to that all the time these days.
Okay. Mounds for the Dead, Don Dragoo.
Yep, that covers Adena, and it's a workmanlike, but getting very dated. But in terms of data, it's everybody has to have it and read it if you're an archaeologist. But some of the interpretations have been changed over the years.
Okay. And finishing up here, we have Indian Mounds of the Ohio of the Middle Ohio Valley. Again, Susan Woodward and Jerry McDonald. So
That's just an older edition of that other book. So that's out of print. The other one has replaced that one.
okay. Well, here's one if you want to go back to 1941, The Mound Builders by Henry Clyde Chatrone. And this one has the photographs of back in the grave robbing days of what was it, Moorhead and so forth that pillaged these mounds for exhibiting these amazing Hopewell artifacts, mica, the thousands of freshwater pearls and copper ornaments, etc. At the world, what was it? The equivalent of the World's Fair, the great, what was it? Exposition in Chicago in
Yeah.
1990 something. I don't know.
Well, and University of Alabama reprinted that, and I wrote the introduction for it.
Yay, there you go. So yeah. Any closing comments on that?
No, it's like the DeGroot thing. Interpretations are really dated, but he's a great writer. He started out as a newspaper writer. It's very easy to read, and it's just priceless data because he excavated Site Mound. He excavated the Hopewell Mound Group. So he's, discovered all these amazing things that define the Hopewell culture. So yeah, it's for its historic relevance and for the data, it's terrific. It's not the most obviously current thing you could read.
Okay. Any other questions from anybody? Okay, then